Hey guys, so it's official. The Asbury Revival ended on March 1st. So, in honor of the revival on the Asbury campus, I'm going to read something that I wrote back when the revival first started. It's a work in progress, and there's a few notes at the end that are incomplete thoughts, but being as the hoopla around this revival has kind of died down, I feel like this isn't going to have much relevance for that much longer, so here goes. The call for a materialist critique of the Asbury Revival. The immediate tendency in reaction to the outpouring of enthusiasm on the campus of Asbury University in Wilmore, Kentucky, is to ask the stupid, obvious, and theological question: is it a genuine revival? As a materialist, it is precisely this question that must be avoided at all costs in order to properly read the events that began on Wednesday, February 8th, when the bi-weekly chapel services at Asbury University continued without stopping for weeks on end. Only by completely rejecting not only any supernatural reading of the manifestations, but also any theological, ideological interpretation of its adherence to orthodoxy, is therein a terrain open to decipher a true materialist movement of the Spirit. It's tempting to first read the Asbury Revival as an explosion of democratic populism. Students were integral parts of the initial manifestations. They were leading worship. They stayed after chapel service and continued to worship. They disrupted campus life by continued nonstop services. The confessions of personal sin by the students were key to fueling the atmosphere of revival. The videos they posted on social media were integral to the spread of the revival at the grassroots level beyond the confines of the campus. There were reports of students forming self-organized teams to protect the purity of spaces from outside disruptors, like protesters screaming things like homophobic things, for example. And the biggest spokesperson in defense of the integrity of revival is Alexandra Presta, a student leader. It's also true that the doctrinal parameters of evangelicalism tend to reinforce populism. The focus of individual conversion experience and being born again are fundamental, democratic, and anti-authoritarian, even if in practice this experience is also extremely easy to co-opt. The idea of the priesthood of all believers, and even of the inerrancy of Scripture, also imply that anyone can read and properly decipher God's truth as revealed in the Bible. Of course, we know the Bible is not inerrant, but that's beyond the focus of the argument for now. What is important is that these beliefs empower individuals to be emboldened to decipher the truth of God themselves. So in these ways, apart from any judgment of the ethical or otherwise correctness of revival's content, one could argue it represents a genuine democratic movement started by students, continued by students, reflecting spiritual values of the students. But is this really the case? The first signs that something may be amiss with the assertions of the democratic purity of this explosion come from a survey of history of Asbury University itself. Far from a singular event, revivals like this seem to be a part of the Asbury brand. Similar revivals occurred in 1905, 1908, 1921, 1950, 1958, 1970, 1992, and 2006. The revival of the 1970s is the most famous, as it is considered to be part of the Jesus People movement. Ironically, a Christian-funded Hollywood film recounting the Jesus Revolution opened within the last week. The temptation is to ironically read the Asbury Revival as some sort of divine promotional event orchestrated by God to ensure the success of the film. or to read it but correctly materialist way, a manipulation of the students by the crafty evangelical Hollywood producers to manufacture revival. So again, not asserting that that's actually the case, but saying that that would be the materialist conspiracy theory. The second concern is the intense interest this revival has generated on the right wing. Radical defenders of debunked race science and popular member of the intellectual dark web opined about the necessity for the West to have a resurgence of what used to be known as the religious Great Awakening. We've had 3 of them, at least, maybe 4. Those had very good effects. Those could change the behaviors of the population in very positive ways, and that's going to be great if that happens. If you have a new upper class that joins in a resurgence of the Judeo-Christian tradition, the United States could be great. But if you end up with authoritarians or of any theological stripe, we're in trouble. His real concern, is predictably secular authoritarianism. But this movement at Asbury has attracted, this is Charles Murray, as Murray hoped, many Christian revisionists happy to offer the ideas of fundamentalism that they had lying around. This revival and calls for it to retain pure Christian ideology have appeared on The Blaze, Fox News, Tucker Carlson, Christian Broadcast Network, The New York Post, Newsmax, The 700 Club, Charlie Kirk, Mark Driscoll, Franklin Graham, and other figures of the evangelical right. Clearly, an elite army armed with traditional Christian theologies lies waiting to reinscribe the enthusiasm of this revival safely into orthodoxy. The third complication is the attempt to separate the reductive, undemocratic forces from the initial explosion of democratic enthusiasm. What is the pure kernel of revival before it is corrupted by management, quote unquote? The most important theoretical recognition is that there is no pure kernel. The democratic form of the initial explosion of enthusiastic manifestation is empty. All populist explosions are empty. They are, by definition, entirely up for grabs. The only truth that can arise from revival is not from its pure content in its initial form, but as a result of a purely contingent process. As long as we imagine populist movements like revivals as anything but weapons to be co-opted by outside forces, will result in a strengthening of the reactionary forces that are dominant in evangelicalism. Only by letting the revival unfold without an ultimate guarantee of its ethical content in any objective sense can the revival be considered genuine. The clearest understanding of Asbury is not a spiritual understanding, and in fact, one must ruthlessly evaluate the revival without resorting to theological critiques. Ironically, to guarantee the genuineness of the Kentucky revival, we must affirm it has no inherent content that is positive or negative in itself. It is only ethically positive or negative in its final byproduct, which is purely contingent and must be co-opted and will be co-opted by forces for either reform or regression.